You know, there's a lot going on in The Evil Within 2, especially on a metatextual level. I actually think it might not be a horror game. I lied, it's a horror game! It's a horror game! Okay, so we've got a lot of ground to cover today, so I won't mess around. In brief, what I want to say is this. The Evil Within 2 is a loving celebration and send-up of the survival horror genre, but it's so much more than that. It embraces the same thing that it knowingly pokes fun at, and in the process, it rises above being just a pastiche, and becomes a newly sincere reinvention of the genre and a genuinely touching human drama. Yes, I know that's a lot to digest. But, rather than just give that to you at face value, I'd like to take some of your time and really show you how The Evil Within 2 works. And to do that, I've got to back up even further and set up a roadmap for us to follow, since this is a surprisingly complicated subject. So, this is how we're going to roll. First, we're going to need some context, so we'll start by breaking down how the game fits into the larger genre of survival horror video games. From there, we'll need to put The Evil Within 2 in conversation with its little brother, The Evil Within, 1. Next, we'll need to talk about some of the philosophy that The Evil Within 2 is working with, and finally, we can conclude with actually breaking down the structure of the game. Oh, and here there be spoilers. Everyone good? Okay, here we go. The survival horror genre goes back a long way, arguably almost to the start of gaming. For my money, I'd argue that as a genre, it got its first real start back in 1982 with the release of Haunted House for the Atari 2600. Riveting. But even though I can't help but bask in its 8-bit glory, I think that for the purposes of our study today, that we should start with Resident Evil on the first PlayStation. Released back in the early 90s, it was one of the first games to codify the survival horror genre. Expanding on the formula set by the 1992 game Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil cemented several tropes of the genre as a whole, including a limited save system, a scarcity of ammunition and healing items, and an emphasis on item management. In a 2016 interview with GameSpot, game creator Shinji Mikami looked back on the creation of the original title. The meeting that got the ball rolling on Resident Evil was in 1993. My then current boss, Tokura Fujiwara, said he wanted us to make a horror game using the systems from Sweet Home, which was a horror game for the Famicom that he had directed. I was actually a big fan of Sweet Home, so I was excited about the project from the beginning. But I was a little worried about how well a horror game would really sell. I decided to think freely without being tied down by traditional genre. I also thought that the sense of despair that you generally get in horror wasn't that well suited to games. At one point during development, I thought about how exhilarating it was to take down a zombie, and about how that was a feeling that you just couldn't get from watching a movie. That was the first time that I really sensed that we had a new genre on our hands. Even though it's a different franchise, The Evil Within owes much of its success to the legacy of Resident Evil. Not only do both titles share the same lead developer, but they share fairly similar design sense mentalities. Both titles choose to contrast the horrific elements with their action-centric elements, pairing tense situations with characters that have combat training and often use powerful weaponry. Furthermore, neither The Evil Within nor Resident Evil tackles the often morose subject matter of horror, a la Jacob's Ladder or The Haunting, choosing instead to play up the more spectacular elements of the genre. Gorn, if you will. I mean, there's even an argument to be made that The Evil Within 2 is a spiritual remake of Resident Evil 2. Put in broadest terms, both games are about a cop and a spy trying to save a little girl from an outbreak of monsters created by the machinations of an evil corporation. I won't dwell on it, but come on. My point is that The Evil Within shares a direct lineage with one of the founding titles of the survival horror genre, and that this title doesn't just work in conversation with The Evil Within, it somewhat defines it. Much of the marketing surrounding the launch of the original game touted Mikami's involvement, especially given the rise of more action-oriented horror titles like Fear or Dead Space. In a Eurogamer article from 2013, Mikami remarked about its return to the genre for the first time since the release of Resident Evil 4, stating, "The reason I came back to survival horror is that survival horror as a genre is becoming all action now. There aren't any real survival horror games left in the world right now. That is the biggest motivation for me." Still, The Evil Within isn't just a spiritual sequel to Resident Evil. No, it's got ties to another major player in the survival horror space, Silent Hill. This ground's a little shakier than the clearer association to Mikami's previous work, but there's still two main factors that tie the two together. The first is the Evil Within's fascination with body horror, an aesthetic direction that it draws right out of Silent Hill. Second, both games operate expressionistically. One of the Evil Within's main gimmicks is that it takes place entirely within an expressionistic play space. See, the game takes place in a fictional device called STEM, which acts as a machine that can link together consciousnesses in a Matrix-like setting. Although this is some B-movie schlock, it also opens up a surprising number of narrative venues since the imagery and level design of the game can be used to metaphorically understand different characters in the game. This mirrors how Silent Hill games create personal hells for each of the game's protagonists, exploring their inner demons through art design. Compare, for example, this monster from The Evil Within, the Keeper, who represents the main antagonist's secretive nature, crushing all those who get near, to Silent Hill 2's Pyramid Head, which represents James Sunderland's sexual frustrations and self-destructive tendencies. Okay, you're right, that comparison's a little on the nose, but you follow. Finally, as a footnote, before we really start digging into these games, I'd like to point out that The Evil Within, as a franchise, draws from horror as a whole, not just video games. Laura, a boss character from the original game, clearly draws from East Asian horror like Ringu or the mythological Jorogumo. The game also has references to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hammer horror cinema, and, brain juice. I'm not sure what that's referencing exactly, so I'm just going to say George Romero before anybody can correct me and move on. So, if The Evil Within is steeped in the language of horror, the question remains, what exactly does the franchise do with that? If The Evil Within is really supposed to be the quintessential survival horror game in a relatively saturated market, what does that kind of survival horror look like? The answers are, surprisingly, both a whole lot and nothing at all, depending on where you are at a given time. The Evil Within franchise might be really aware of how it fits into the horror medium as a whole, but it took a sequel for them to figure out exactly what to do with that. In fewer words, The Evil Within 1 is a structural mess, and it's not a very fun one at that. I'll be honest, and this is me being somewhat anecdotal, I never actually beat The Evil Within, though I did ultimately learn the full story by other means. I gave it a try for the first few hours, and when it failed to present a coherent narrative but instead assaulted me with a veritable array of horror cliches, several of which I've already pointed out, I was left disappointed. It's not that they were presented poorly, it's just that they were presented without any context or substance. I'm reminded of game critic Ben Yahtzee Crowshaw's commentary on the game in his 2014 review. It's like somebody said, "Hey, make a horror game," and somebody else said, "Okay, what about?" I just told you, horror! No, I mean, what happens in it? What's the context? What are the major themes you want to work with? Horror, horror, and horror. And so the result is this undisciplined mishmash of horror set pieces and imagery barely justified by a toilet tissue flimsy plot populated entirely by stock characters. He's not wrong either. The entire game plays like a pastiche of other horror ideas without a cohesive identity. On the macro level, this makes some sense. After all, this is a game about being trapped in a psychotic killer's brain. However, the game fails to communicate this idea in a timely manner, and so the bulk of the game reads like Horror, the game. While I'd call The Evil Within a pastiche of horror tropes, I feel that's overly generous. None of the content is presented with any degree of self-awareness, even if it does demonstrate some impressive genre literacy. Sure, you're being chased by a chainsaw-wielding lunatic in a rusty, abandoned industrial nightmare, but more saddening than the lack of innovation is the lack of commentary. Context is king, and The Evil Within treats context more like a justification for its visuals than a way to deepen the themes or ideas of the game. It's like a McDonald's hamburger, good for a fix and a pinch, but ultimately unsatisfying and filled with limp lettuce and that fake American cheese stuff, and I've lost track of this metaphor. Ironically, the sequel leans in even more heavily to cliché than the original, but unlike the original title, it pauses to examine each of its clichés. The game joyfully points out its stereotypes before heaping even more on with a gleeful grin. Here, not only is Sebastian an alcoholic ex-cop, but he's sporting a new beard, spouting action hero one-liners and searching for his missing child. He couldn't be more of a trope if he tried.
I'm not a soldier. I'm just a technician.
I know.
Stop, or I'll shoot! No!
A soldier would have taken the safety off.
Even the gameplay falls more in line with game industry trends, emphasizing crafting items from supplies found in an open world that encourages stealth as a gameplay option. Popularized by titles like Metal Gear Solid 5, parts of The Last of Us, The Forest, and countless other titles, The Evil Within 2 doesn't so much innovate as much as refine, just taking on popular gameplay loops and running with them to, hopefully, great effect. If the first game is a pastiche of survival horror of yesteryear, then the new game feels like a pastiche of the contemporary video game marketplace. It's campy as hell, but the game doesn't try to shy away or downplay its silly or trope-heavy nature. Quite the contrary, The Evil Within 2 seems to revel in its sillier moments, playfully flipping back and forth between tense horror and gory silliness. For every fight with Stefano's Obscura, Jesus, that thing gives me the willies. You've got Sebastian's reaction to being ambushed in a church earlier in the game.
Fuck that.
It's not that the horror is any less effective, rather that the horror is being mitigated by a tongue-in-cheek reflexivity. In less pretentious talk, it's having its cake and eating it too. The game pairs its insane serial killers and evil corporations with a story about a broken family and a man learning to cope with his personal demons and past traumas, all without descending into biting sarcasm or parody. Which, speaking of which...
If you change your mind, I'm the first in line.
Before we tackle the biggest and arguably most important part of The Evil Within 2 and why it's so worth talking about, I think it'd be a good idea to scooch out a little and take a look at the bigger picture. There's been this weird reaction to the ironic sarcasm of postmodernism for the last, 20 or 30 years or so. I'd be more specific, but it's actually kind of hard to pin down the exact timeline since it's a reaction to a reaction. Let me back up and explain what I mean. Postmodernism, as name would imply, is a philosophical response to modernism. Modernist thought posits that there is a universal truth in the universe that exists, but that we, due to our own fragmented views, will never be able to get to it. By contrast, postmodernism argues that while we are definitely trapped in our own subjectivity, there never was a capital T truth to get in the first place. Everything is shades of reflexivity referring back to itself until the original meaning is lost in endless degrees of reference. With that in mind, most postmodern art is deeply ironic, sarcastic of exactly what it invokes and mocks. But in 1993, American author, essayist, and bandana enthusiast David Foster Wallace wrote an essay titled E Unibus Plurum, Television and U.S. Fiction, an essay that criticized television programming for being overly reflexive and ironic without any real substance. I'll post a link to the essay in the description, but in short, Wallace's point is that in delving so deeply into irony, the 1990s television landscape was so thoroughly entrenched in cynicism and self-reference as to be, in effect, meaningless. TV was commentary on commentary, and at that point, nothing was actually being said.
The problem is I think postmodernism has, to a large extent, run its course. It was very useful, it seems to me, because the culture, this was a real beaker of acid in the face of the culture. The culture at the time this came out, this was before, the youth rebellion in the 60s, was very staid and very conservative and very Alfred Kazanish. And the problem, though, is that a lot of the shticks of postmodernism, irony, cynicism, irreverence, are now part of whatever it is that's enervating in the culture itself, right? Burger King now sells hamburgers with "you gotta break the rules."
However, I think this quote from the end of E Unibus Plurum is actually far more prophetic. The next real literary rebels in this country might well emerge as some weird bunch of anti-rebels, born oglers who dare somehow to back away from ironic watching, who have the childish gall, actually, to endorse and instantiate single entendre principles. These anti-rebels would be outdated, of course, before they even started, dead on the page. Real rebels, as far as I can see, risk disapproval. The old postmodern insurgents risked the gasp and squeal. Today's risks are different. The new rebels might be artists willing to risk the yawn, the rolled eyes, the cool smile, the nudged ribs, the parody of gifted ironists, the "oh how banal," to risk accusations of sentimentality. It would take over 10 years for the sentiment to really take hold, but in the last 10 years, we've seen it skyrocket to popularity, even if most people don't know what to call it. Shows like My Brother, and Me, Parks and Rec, and pretty much every single Wes Anderson film ever, all embrace what many scholars are calling metamodernism, a sort of post-postmodernism. But we're not gonna call it post-postmodernism, because that would be stupid. I'll try and put this another way. In an essay titled Notes on Metamodernism, critics Vermeulen and Van de Akker write at length about the origins and applications of metamodernist theory, comparing it to a metaphorical donkey. It's A weird metaphor, but hear me out. They write, Metamodernism moves for the sake of moving, attempts in spite of its inevitable failure. It seeks forever a truth that it never expects to find. Like a donkey, Metamodernism chases a carrot that it never manages to eat because the carrot is always just beyond its reach. But precisely because it never manages to eat the carrot, it also never ends the chase, setting foot in moral realms the modern donkey, having eaten its carrot elsewhere, will never encounter. Entering political domains the postmodern donkey, having abandoned the chase, will never come across. Metamodernism uses the reflexivity and self-awareness of postmodernism to deconstruct narratives, but it uses the sincerity of modernism and its precursors to anchor itself. It swings like a pendulum back and forth, never settling on either course, but, to borrow again from Notes on Metamodernism, to prevent apathy. It questions meta-narratives, but maintains the importance of pursuing truth even in the ontological failure of absolute truth. To be sincere is to find some meaning, even if that's not a stopping point. While I was researching this subject, I stumbled onto an art show review by art critic and New York Magazine contributor Jerry Saltz. Funnily enough, he's actually referenced in Notes on Metamodernism as well, and though he's not quite as eloquent or procedural as the aforementioned essay, I think he captures the point brilliantly. He writes, I'm noticing a new approach to art making in museum and gallery shows. It's an attitude that says, I know that the art I'm creating may seem silly, even stupid, or that it might have been done before, but that doesn't mean this isn't serious. At once knowingly self-conscious about art, unafraid and unashamed, these young artists not only see the distinction between earnestness and detachment as artificial, they grasp that they can be ironic and sincere at the same time.
Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look.
The Evil Within 2 might be a horror game. It might feature gruesome monsters, human and imaginary alike, but that's not the point of The Evil Within 2. The game invokes all of these horror tropes and cliches, but it presents them earnestly, creating a space that lets us laugh at horror tradition while at the same time sincerely engaging with it. Just like how it tells Sebastian's story. We begin the game in the light of Sebastian looking for his daughter, Lily, and significant portions of the plot are dedicated to exploring his relationship with both his wife, Myra, and his daughter prior to the events of the game. For that matter, neither Stefano nor Father Theodore really add much to the story outside of standing in Sebastian's way or else forcing Sebastian to face his inner demons. In fact, both die well before the game's ending because, and bear with me, The Evil Within 2, unlike its predecessor, isn't a game about horror. It's just a game that uses its awareness of the survival horror genre to lead us through it. By relaxing our expectations around what should be, for all intents and purposes, a paint-by-numbers video game experience, the emotional moments and undercurrents of the story are given more weight when they land. Even when we do face monsters, they tell us more about the characters who conjure them up or become them than they act as illusions to other genre entities. It's about how circumstances tore the family apart and how, in coping with their trauma in different ways, they fail to repair it. Sebastian's situation is terrifying, but in it we see the lengths to which he'll go to make things right. Hell, we see the lengths to which all of the characters who were used by Mobius will go to atone for the past. And everything culminates in the final few hours of The Evil Within 2. Sebastian finally reaches the end of his road, only to be confronted with his wife Myra. He believes that his daughter Lily will be safer outside of the STEM system, and he'll stop at nothing to bring her out into the real world. Myra believes that she can keep Lily safe in STEM, despite the fact it's collapsing because she has already experienced the loss of her daughter once and is not emotionally prepared to suffer such a loss again. It's an impasse, and in a final boss which is at once ridiculous and heartbreaking, Sebastian and Myra face off to decide the fate of their daughter. In his review of The Evil Within 2, game critic Noah Caldwell-Gervais contextualizes the final portion of the game with his own experiences as a child of divorced parents. He remarks, I was getting ready to feel like this final boss was kind of a dumb idea for a boss fight until it made me, quite unexpectedly, very sad. My parents' divorce was about as bitter, drawn out, and acrimonious as it got, and I remember the way they talked about each other, the angry distortions they'd used to try and poison my opinion of the other one. Imagination and perception are dangerous things. That's why horror media plays around with them so much, makes real and present the kind of awful things we think or feel or say. They were just regular people who couldn't stand the sight of one another, yet in teasing out the monstrousness of these feelings by giving them form, by giving them weaknesses and solutions, horror lets us consider such animosities in ways we might not, just as a vague feeling. There are no monsters in the Evil Within's universe that are not imaginary, but that does not stop them from being dangerous. The horror of the Evil Within 2 isn't serial killers or bloody abominations, it's about a single family, the events that tore them apart and the lengths they'll go to try and save what little is left. In the end, despite Sebastian's best efforts, his family will remain broken regardless. While he is able to get his daughter back, he can do nothing to save the entirety of his family. He and Myra are able to forgive each other for everything that's happened, but in the end, only Sebastian and Lily can escape, while Myra stays behind to ensure the best possible future for her husband and her daughter. They can get their happy ending, but only by her sacrifice. For all the blood and viscera, this is what the Evil Within 2 is really about. The Evil Within 2 is a horror game, but it's got a more sincere message beneath the references and tropes, and that's what makes it such a remarkable experience.
Want to change the world. There's nothing to it.
If you change your mind,
Take a chance.
I'm the first in line.
Take a chance.
Honey, I'm still free. Take a chance on me. If you need me, let me know. Gonna be around. If you got no place to go when you're feeling down. If you're all alone.